This week in her column for Unheard, it was Mary Harrington who quoted Tacitus, who observed that it was the punitive assault of Boudicca's daughters that inspired her to put Roman troops in London to the torch and to the sword. I wonder if there's a metaphor here when a senior member of Labour's front bench dismisses the Pakistani grooming gang scandal as a racist dog whistle.
I don't know whether you saw the documentary on Channel 4 about rape gangs over
this.
We
want to blow that little trumpet now, do we? Yeah, okay.
There was a real issue.
Let's get that dog whistle out, shall we?
That and Reform's revolt against the Uniparty this week on Tomlinson Talks. Let's get into our first major story. So, last week, on Friday, the 2nd of May, Lucy Powell, who is a Labour MP, who is the leader of the House of Commons on Labour's front bench in Keir Starmer's cabinet, joined BBC show Any Questions, and Tim Montgomery, the founder of Conservative Home and Unheard, former advisor to Boris Johnson, now turned Reform UK advisor, was on the panel, and he asked Lucy Powell if she had seen Channel 4's new documentary, which is called Groomed, a national scandal. Now, it's a fair question to ask, given our collective media and political class in the UK ran an astroturfed circus around the Netflix drama, which they called a documentary, Adolescence, for almost a month. It's impressive, I suppose, a mighty coincidence that Tender, the charity promoting Adolescence, was co-founded by Keir Starmer's ex-girlfriend and has received millions in government grants over the years. So a fair question to ask a sitting government minister if she has seen a documentary on a scandal that her government are accused of covering up, or at the very least, grossly mishandling. And Lucy Powell's response was to dismiss this question as a dog whistle and blowing a little trumpet, insinuating that Tim had only raised it because of the race and religion of the perpetrators and to score cheap political points. Have a listen.
I don't know whether you saw the documentary on Channel 4 about rape gangs over this.
We want to blow that little trumpet now, do we? Yeah, okay.
There was a real issue.
Let's get that dog whistle out, shall we?
Okay, Lucy. Yeah. The councils, there were so many people who were so afraid for good. Can I just finish the point, just for 1 minute?
Finish that point, Tim, and then I'll bring in Helen.
Look, there were so many people in local government, in the authorities, who, for good reasons, were worried about upsetting community tensions, that those girls went undefended. Now, there were good reasons, but no one has still been brought to justice for that. So you tell me, Lucy, that this isn't a culture in local government. It's just not true.
Now, after the scandal erupted on X, she tried making excuses. She responded to Alison Pearson, the Telegraph journalist, who is now famous for receiving a knock on the door from Essex police for a deleted tweet in relation to a public order offence and a non-crime hate incident. She tried excusing her comments, first of all, by saying, quote, "It was because of the context of the discussion, not because of the issue." So deflecting, denying, and then deleting, because that post is no longer available. Fortunately, we do have it screenshotted. So there it is. She then posted to X what she described as an apology. In the heat of the discussion on Any Questions, AQ, I would like to clarify that I regard issues of child exploitation and grooming with the utmost seriousness. I'm sorry if this was unclear. I was challenging the political point scoring around it, not the issue itself. As a constituency MP, I've dealt with horrendous cases. This government is acting to get to the truth and deliver justice. Now, excuse me, but in the heat of the moment, I've never accidentally minimised, deflected, or denied as a racist dog whistle child rape, torture, abuse, and in many instances, murder. Funny how I've managed to never do that, isn't it, Lucy? And it received such a loud, outraged reaction because it was clear that Lucy Powell was going on pure gut instinct and was acting as the id of Starmer's government. This is the reason that she won't be sacked, by the way, despite Labour's record low approval ratings, especially in Keir Starmer, despite Labour's awful performance in the recent local elections, which we'll get to later, Keir Starmer could try to save face by throwing one of his least popular cabinet ministers, especially after this remark, under the bus. But he won't, because if you remember, Keir Starmer, in the height of this scandal reaching global attention thanks to Elon Musk on X, responding to the likes of Charlie Peters, Sam Bidwell and Max Temper's efforts, as well as my own in a small way, to bring this attention to the global fore. In response to that, Keir Starmer said that too many MPs in Britain were jumping on a far-right bandwagon.
And when politicians, and I mean politicians, who sat in government for many years, are casual about honesty, decency, truth, and the rule of law, calling for inquiries because they want to jump on a bandwagon of the far right, then that affects politics, because a robust debate can only be based on the true facts.
So Keir Starmer genuinely believes that dismissing the rape, torture, abuse and murder of white working class girls is just fine and dandy because the perpetrators are Pakistani Muslim men on whom Labour has historically relied to be a client constituency voting bloc. And of course, in marginal constituencies like Jess Phillips, where she only has a 693 vote majority, with Independent and Workers' Party of Britain pro-Gaza candidates nipping at her heels and heckling her at her election victory speech, they don't want to upset said community and have them wander off the plantation. And so they prioritise their sectarian concerns. And this is something that I mentioned last week. This is why Pakistani heritage Birmingham Labour MP Tahir Ali is lobbying for the censorship of those who criticise or burn the Quran as a form of protest, and why he and sectarian Muslim MP Ayub Khan were lobbying for the construction of an airport in Mirpur, Pakistan. The region, by the way, where, as a British anthropologist found in the late 80s, the majority of British Pakistanis can trace their heritage back to until the recent Boris wave. So that means because these rape and torture gangs have been going on for multiple decades now, that Mirpur is the exact region where the majority of the perpetrators come from. As I said, I'm not interested in that airport unless it receives more deportation flights than it facilitates departures. But anyway, look, getting back to Lucy Powell, she's really speaking on behalf of what the government really think about this issue. And again, it's telling they were obsessed with adolescents, but not this. So they are clearly choosing their client groups, and they are choosing what is the acceptable face of misogyny in this country, while willingly, knowingly importing through illegal and legal routes virulent hatred of women, particularly white, working class, non-Muslim women, by men from the barbarous third world, where rape and torture is used as a means of keeping one's wife, one's family members subjugated, one's clan in a state of honour, and as a punishment in intertribal warfare. And so this will be excused. And it was excused over the weekend when Wes Streeting, the sitting health secretary, who, I remind you, helped draft the all-party parliamentary group on British Muslims' definition of Islamophobia, which, much like his definition of a woman, was circular, because it said, Islamophobia is a kind of racism rooted in racism that concerns Muslimness and perceived Muslimness. Right. Anyway, Wes Streeting did the media rounds and said on Sky News, in Lucy Powell's defence, yes, I think she's made a genuine mistake. She's owned up to it, she said sorry, and will move on. Now, first of all, she hasn't said sorry. If you notice the wording of Lucy Powell's so-called apology, it positioned the public, who heard exactly what she said, as the ones that did Lucy Powell wrong, because they misinterpreted her, and she has in fact always been on the side of victims, even though it was the victims themselves, the survivors of the rape gangs, who criticised her. Sarah Wilson from Rochdale said, quote, "They never cared and they never will. They totally dismiss survivors and our experiences of being groomed." And this was in response to Powell's comments. And actually, Scarlett and her dad Marlon, who were featured in the Channel 4 documentary, told The Telegraph, quote, "We feel abused and disrespected once again, and we did not anticipate this kind of treatment from our government leaders." So this is comments like Powell's, reinforcing the chilling effect about discussing the exact race, religion, ethnic background and beliefs of the Pakistani Muslim perpetrators here, placing that chilling effect upon them, saying that to even discuss this crime is a racist dog whistle, which was the reason why it was all dressed up in euphemisms and shoved under the rug by police forces, social workers, local councillors and politicians for decades. Lucy Powell doing that is taken by the victims and their families as a kind of repetition of the abuse they suffered. So no, Wes, no, Lucy, you don't get to decide if your apology is sufficient, and you don't get to decide when the public moves on from this. And this is why people were clamouring, me included, for Powell to be sacked and or resign. This was Chris Philp, the Shadow Home Secretary, and then leader of the opposition, Kemi Badenoch, by retweeting him, called for her to be sacked. Robert Jenrick shared the original clip of BBC's Any Questions and said it was absolutely abhorrent that she'd done this. Katie Lamb MP, famous, of course, for challenging Jess Phillips during her announcement that the rape gang inquiries would be rescinded before they were hastily reinstated because of all the backlash. Katie Lamb MP said that she should apologise or resign. And Rupert Lowe wrote, independent MP Rupert Lowe, obviously, who's leading the independent rape gang inquiry, which as a crowdfunder has surpassed £600,000. Rupert Lowe wrote a letter to Powell and then later compared her treatment to that of Lucy Connolly, the traumatised, because of her miscarriage, childminder and wife of a Conservative councillor who is currently rotting in prison for, I think, 32 months because she made an ill-advised tweet during last summer's Southport protests and riots, and then hastily deleted it. And then the Crown Prosecution Service and police misquoted and misrepresented her statements after her conviction and after she was encouraged to plead guilty because she thought she would go home and see her daughter sooner. She has now been denied visitation rights after speaking to journalist Alison Pearson and telling her story. So Lucy Connolly is rotting in prison for a short-lived and deleted tweet for which she apologised. Lucy Powell remains a cabinet minister despite denying, or at least minimising and dismissing as a racist dog whistle, the rape and torture of thousands of girls for decades in Britain, while her own government is embroiled in a scandal about their lack of appetite to bring the perpetrators and those covered it up to justice. So, yeah, there's very much a two-tier policing system in Britain, something that the Home Affairs Select Committee recently denied as a conspiracy theory, despite the members of the Home Affairs Select Committee either being members of councils like Sean Davies in Telford, where the rape gangs have operated and where the cover-up was perpetuated for years for fears of inflaming community tensions, or the likes of Belle Ribeiro Addy, who's very happy to throw accusations of two-tier policing against the Met Police when it concerns black suspects who are overwhelmingly more likely to commit violent and gang-related crime. But as soon as it concerns the mistreatment of the white host majority population of the UK, well, two-tier policing couldn't possibly exist because it doesn't depict her identity as the aggrieved victim group entitled to restitution and reparations, isn't it? Now, you would think this is utterly inexcusable. You would think that Labour continuing to cover up, deny, deflect and obfuscate from the Pakistani rape gang scandal is not something anyone can rush to the defence of. But no, BBC journalist and former Guardian editor Michael White decided to dive in front of that particular bullet on X, and he defended Powell, saying, and I quote, "I understand why Lucy Powell apologised for her dog whistle comment in our dishonest media world," so blaming the external media, even though she was appearing on the BBC, which is heavily biased towards Labour, and he would know, as a BBC contributor who supports Labour. But, he says, she was quite right. People like Tiny Tim would not have raised such an issue if the groomers, murderers or rapists, if they'd, that's a typo on his part, if they'd been one of their own. So he is accusing Tim Montgomery of only raising the issue because the perpetrators were of an ethnic and religious outgroup. Now, contained within this is the tacit admission that the rape gang scandal is perpetuated by an immigrant outgroup to the indigenous in-group. So at least we've got that tacit admission inside this defence of the indefensible. Michael White thought this was an absolutely stunning tweet. Now, I would suggest to Mr. White and Lucy Powell that it's not so self-evident that Lucy Powell is working on behalf of these victims if the victims themselves say, "You've basically made me relive my rape and torture." And if you even have to clarify that in the heat of the moment you may have been perceived to minimize child rape, then you may have miscommunicated something, or you may have said something abhorrent. And so the problem is with you rather than the broader media environment, the person who brought it up, or the people who all heard exactly what you said and were shocked and disgusted. But then, right, in response to criticism, White wrote, "It was horrible, but it was a bit more complicated than that, wasn't it? Sex often is." No, Michael, child rape is not complicated at all. Weird that you would think it was. Now, I know that some former presenters like Hugh Edwards at the BBC would think that sexuality and children has more blurred lines than the law or sane-thinking people like us would say it does. I think it's fundamentally not complicated, inexcusable, evil, and wrong. So it's strange that Michael White would say it is complicated, and then later repost a clipping from a Rotherham local newspaper where a 15-year-old girl was hauled up in front of court after being abused by Pakistani male perpetrators and condemned as sexually promiscuous. And he said, well, this is proof that it's always been complicated. No, it's proof that the cover-up has been going for 50 years in 50 towns and cities across the UK. Work which, by the way, Open Justice, Adam Rem, and Melissa Tort, and Charlie Peters of GB News, as well as a few other people who'd like to remain anonymous, have been doing tracking where the convictions, where the gangs have been operating up and down the UK, and also drawing lines for the trafficking routes between towns and cities where inquiries and convictions have not even happened yet. Bradford being one of the major towns where a lot of this activity intersects, but where the local council, dominated historically by Labour and also by members of Pakistani and Asian heritage councillors, they've been blocking local inquiries for ages, despite having a large volume of offences and suspects in their area. Very curious that. It's also even more sick and ironic because the Channel 4 documentary in question, which I say people should watch because it interviews the victims of the gangs and is honest about the Pakistani heritage of the rapists. It doesn't delve into the religious motivations, which we all know are there. For example, subjecting girls to forced Quran readings, having them bark like a dog in a cage, given the prominence of dogs in Islam. That takes on some symbolic meaning there. Very, very degrading. And, of course, the wives of the rapists excusing to Yasmin Ali Harbi Brown the acts committed by their family members and members of their community against white girls because they said, by Allah, have you seen how they dress? Saying they bring it upon themselves, right? In the Channel 4 documentary, this asabaya, which is the Arabic word for kind of clannish solidarity, ethnic and religious solidarity, which entrenches the cover-up among these communities and is the reason why they see white working-class girls as not their moral equivalents. They only extend morality as far as their clan, family, and religion, allows them to. This Channel 4 documentary explains or provides an example of how this is perpetuated today. So it's extra ironic that Michael White would accuse Tim Montgomery of only raising this because the perpetrators are his ethnic outgroup, and he wouldn't dare raise the problem of a white rapist, for example. Pure projection by the woke part, as usual, because in the Channel 4 documentary, it follows a campaign group run by a woman called Samira Khan, and Samira Khan has broken the law because her brother, Irfan Khan, he was sentenced to 12 years in prison for 3 offences, including rape and making threats to kill. And they broke the law because her protest group, insisting that her brother is innocent of all wrongdoing, that the charges are made up, that the victims are not real victims, that the court system, the police, and the victims themselves are all racist, and this is one giant conspiracy against the Pakistani community who didn't do anything wrong. They decided to live stream with her brother while he was in prison. And then, on live streams, they decided to disclose the protected identities of the girls who had been raped. So, I would hope the law is brought to bear down upon them. But it does show that the reason this has been hushed up for so long isn't just because MPs like Dennis McShane, as a self-professed Guardian reading liberal lefty, didn't want to rock the multicultural boat, or because Simon Danchuk called the police on Katie Hopkins for saying it was disgraceful for him to drape himself in the Pakistani flag just as the rape gangs received their first round of attention around 2013 to 2015 as convictions were rolling through in Oxford, Rotherham, Rochdale, and the like. It's not just because local councillors and social workers and police officers were petrified of inflaming community tensions and so had to refer euphemistically to the Pakistani taxi drivers who were facilitating the trafficking of girls around other cities to men of a certain background working in a certain occupation. As you could read in the Casey report, it isn't just all that. It's because the community themselves were keeping a lid on it. Lots of people knew. Lots of people, after they were confronted with the atrocities committed by their husbands, fathers, brothers, cousins, and sons, made excuses for it, or after the perpetrators were released from prison, they assimilate seamlessly back into the community. I mean, for example, there's a haunting tale that Charlie Peters often tells about the paedophile honesty box in one house, where a girl would be kept hostage, she would be raped repeatedly by men, and they would be expected to deposit their money for her pimping out in a box on the front of the house, and at the end of the month, the landlord would come along and pick up the tab for all of these children that had been raped by their Pakistani Muslim captors. The reason a lid is kept on this is because these communities, these ethnic and religious enclaves, do not have solidarity or sympathy for the host population and their abused children. And so the projection is disgusting and ironic by the likes of Michael White, who say that we wouldn't be talking about this if there were white rapists. Yeah, we would. The reason we're talking about this is because, not often enough, in my opinion, see Hugh Edwards, but largely, white rapists are not systematically covered up for by all the powers that be because of their race and religion. And the Pakistani rape gangs certainly are. The cover-up is continuing even today. Now, it's interesting as well to note that Michael White, his son, is the former Chief of Staff to Keir Starmer from September 2021 to November 2022. And that's Sam White. Sam White is married to a woman called Katie Jane White, and it might sound a familiar name to you if you're in Leeds North West, because she's been the Labour MP since 2024. It's notable that Leeds North West has seen vast numbers of sexual offences committed against children by Pakistani and Asian heritage men since 2009, according to some new data, with a conviction rate of only 17% across all of West Yorkshire. But since becoming an MP, she hasn't spoken about this issue once in Parliament. Not once. She participated in a violence against women and girls session in Parliament, but didn't raise the problem of the Pakistani Muslim rape gangs operating in her own area. Curious how the family are just completely silent on this, and how Michael White might feel the need, despite professing to be an ostensibly neutral journalist and a truth teller and holding power to account, feel the need to run interference for Keir Starmer's Labour government, who have done nothing but diminish, deny, and deflect from the historic and ongoing abuses perpetrated by Pakistani Muslim men, and to call those raising the alarm about this unconscionable treatment of children jumping on a far-right bandwagon. Following the Labour front bench's dismissal and denial of the Pakistani grooming gangs this week as a racist dog whistle, it just so happens that we have brand new data from West Yorkshire Police, reported initially and exclusively by yours truly at Courage Media. Now, this comes from Freedom of Information access requests filed to West Yorkshire for the period between 2009 and the 31st of December 2024. So this is brand new and up-to-date data for all 5 districts in West Yorkshire about the ethnicity of the perpetrators, suspects, and victims of child sexual abuse offences in the 5 districts. So that is Bradford, Calderdale, Kirklees, Lees, and Wakefield. Bradford had the highest at 2,419 offences. That's 34.1% of the total. They had 200 offences a year, at least, for consecutive years. And yet, despite being the intersecting area where a lot of this trafficking of children goes on, have routinely denied having a local or at least national independent statutory-led inquiry into the rape gangs operating in their area. The MP for Keighley, Robbie Moore, has been consistent on this issue, and he asked Professor Alexis Jay, who did the Jay report into Rotherham in 2014, why local councillors have refused to do this. He happened to ask it on the same day that Bradford again denied a inquiry into the historic and ongoing rape gangs, and Professor Alexis Jay said because they don't want to be another Rotherham. So they want to uphold the reputation not only of the area, and Bradford was awarded City of Culture in 2025, sickening, but also they clearly want to uphold the reputation of the Pakistani Muslim communities from where a disproportionate number of perpetrators spawn. And we are seeing in this new figures the overrepresentation of Pakistani Muslim men among the suspects and offenders for child sexual abuse by rates of 2 to 4 times their share of the local and national population. So this is now undeniable. Anyone who wants to deny the ethnic and religious composition of these gangs in this specific area, and of course nationwide, for which we have historic data, we're getting more up-to-date data thanks to the works of other people like Adam Wren and Charlie Peters. Anyone who wants to deny that is flat out denying atrocities. They are minimizing it for an ulterior motive. Especially if they are confronted with the realities of this, they cannot appeal to being misinformed. They are deliberately dampening down these atrocities committed against children for ideological motives. So they are bad faith actors. So as far as the other districts, Leeds had 1,601 offences. That's 22.5% of the total. Kirklees had 1,547. That's 21.8% of the total. Wakefield had 803, 11.3% of the total. And Calderdale had 730, which is 10.3% of the total offences. This is all written up in a tweet thread I did and an article on Courage Media, which everyone can read, and on Substack, all linked down in the description so you can follow along. Now, despite these thousands of offences committed, only 1,272 charges were filed. That's between 2009 and 2024. That's a charge rate of only 17.9%. Among the suspects, Asian Pakistanis, mainly men of course, were 21.48%. That's 1,183. So 21.48% of the suspects, and that is a per capita rate for the local population of West Yorkshire of 507.7 suspects per 100,000 people. And of course, that's a much more concentrated rate if you break it down by age and gender, because, of course, it's not elderly Pakistani women perpetrating these crimes. However, the communities do often know about them and stay quiet about it because they do not share a race, ethnicity, and religion with the victims, but they do with the perpetrators. Bangladeshis had a much lower overall rate at 0.89% of the perpetrators, only 49, but a high per capita rate of 408.3 per 100,000 people. Other, including Arab ethnicities in the area, were 0.96%, only 53, of the perpetrators, but a high per capita rate, I believe the highest, of 530 per 100,000. So despite Asians overall, and it's a crude term, because it's not the Japanese doing this, it's not the Sikhs doing this, but nevertheless, despite Asians being 16% of West Yorkshire's population and 10% of the overall population, according to the most recently available data of the 2021 census, they are, in total, twice as likely per capita to offend than their share of the population. And it gets worse again when you exclude women and children from all of this. So they're about 24% of overall perpetrators, despite being only 16% of the local population and 10% of the total national population. Curious that white British are still the demographic majority in the country, that's 74.4% of the total population. We don't have a local breakdown because West Yorkshire did not provide it in their 2021 census analysis. But despite being 74.4% of the country as of 2021, white British suspects were only 44.5% of the total. So that's 2,454. And that's a per capita rate for the local population of 155.3 per 100,000. So much lower. Black African and Caribbean had a lower percentage share at 1.83%. There's 101 perpetrators or suspects. But a higher per capita share of 459.1 per 100,000. So let's add all of the non-white British suspects up as a total. 55.4 25.6% of the suspects, despite being only 25.6% of the population. So that is double the offending rate of their share of the population. That's much higher than white Brits. And so, as well, add on to this the fact that 6.4%, so that's 355, of suspects had their ethnicity not stated, and a further 13%, that's 715, had their ethnicity not recorded by police. Now, as Neil O'Brien, who is the Shadow Education Secretary, has mentioned before, this is inexcusable because the age and the sex of perpetrators is often recorded, but the ethnicity of perpetrators has gone increasingly unreported as migration has continued over the years and as the offences have continued to rise. So this seems to be a decision by the police, who are of course motivated by proving their anti-racist bona fides ever since they were called institutionally racist in the 1999 Macpherson report of the murder of Stephen Lawrence. This seems to be a purposeful effort by the police not to record the ethnicities of perpetrators, to fudge the numbers, to make certain ethnic minority communities look less bad. This is the entire motivating factor, by the way, why they record hate crimes or non-crime hate incidents, or why they add racial aggravation charges atop existing crimes. But they never add these racial aggravation charges or religious aggravation hate crime charges atop the crimes of the rape gangs, despite being explicitly motivated by anti-white racism, anti-English prejudice, and anti-kuffar, non-Muslim believer, hatred. It only ever goes one way. So if we take that total, about 19.4%, of additional suspects whose ethnicity was not recorded, we can say that the total maximum share of Asian, again, usually Pakistani heritage, suspects is 42.73%. So a potential 42.73% of perpetrators of child sexual abuse, and this is not even broken down by gang-based, group-based child sexual exploitation, but 42.3% of perpetrators of child sexual abuse between 2009 and 2024, right at the start of 2025, in West Yorkshire, were of Asian, predominantly Pakistani male, heritage. That is 4 times their share of the population, if that number is accurate. So between 2 to 4 times their share of the population is the offending rate for Pakistani Asian heritage men in child sexual abuse crimes. Now, this tracks with existing numbers because, of course, 15 to 23% of sex offences are committed by foreign nationals between 2021 and 2023, and that's despite them being 9.3% of the population. This is not broken down by those born abroad and given British citizenship as well, which is 16% of the total population, because, of course, just comparing foreign nationals and British nationals does not give you an accurate picture of who is doing these crimes by ethnic heritage, by cultural background, and whether or not they hold a British passport does not automatically make them less likely to commit a crime, of course, because they still retain their culture and identity from the place that they came from, and often second-generation migrants repeat the criminal and economic patterns of their parents, and we've seen this from data from Denmark and the Netherlands, by incarceration, by economic participation, by their tax receipts, and, as we saw with Henry Jackson's society polling recently, by their social attitudes, because it's getting even worse among second-generation, well-educated, male British-born Muslims, but large numbers of Muslim men, 75%, do not believe, for example, that Hamas committed rape and murder on October the 7th in Israel, which means they're more likely to justify and excuse away such atrocities committed against the white British non-Muslim population in this country. And also, in January, The Telegraph reported data from 43 police forces in England and Wales that showed Pakistani men are up to 4 times more likely to commit group-based child sex offences. So when it's broken down by group-based offences, it is also 4 times their share of the population. But this is brand new data from West Yorkshire, an area which has historically resisted any kind of nationally led or even local inquiry into their ongoing and historic Pakistani Muslim rape gangs. Among victims, this is where data gets quite curious. White British make up the largest overall share at 55.6%. That's 3,960 victims. That's the largest in absolute terms, with a per capita rate of 250.6 per 100,000. It's also to be noted here that a third of victims did not have their ethnicity recorded. Again, an inexcusable dropping of the ball by the police. Black, African and other black victims were 0.88% of victims at 63, with a per capita rate of 1,260 per 100,000. So that's quite a high per capita rate. Mixed ethnicities had 1.75% of victims at 124, a per capita rate of 425.4 per 100,000. Again, these are local West Yorkshire demographic numbers. But despite Pakistanis being the largest single ethnicity of perpetrators or suspects, and the largest share of the largest racial category for suspects in West Yorkshire, they had the lowest share for victims at 2.9, one of the lowest shares for victims at 2.96%. There's only 211 victims and a low per capita rate of 90.6 per 100,000. Now, every single one of those crimes, no matter the ethnicity, race, and religion of the victims, is an atrocity. Every perpetrator needs to be held to account. But it shows that the abuses are committed across communities, which means they're not happening all within households, which is the narrative, and it is a necessary avenue to explore, don't get me wrong, but is the narrative put forward by the likes of Liberal Democrat MP Tessa Munt, who says that it is white children victimised by white paedophiles that make up the overwhelming majority of these offences.
Tessa Munt.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I say my blood is boiling listening to this stuff coming from the Conservative benches. If they had read the ICSA, the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, they would recognise that there are hundreds of thousands of people alive today, people just like me, white girls who suffered at the hands of white men, and they've just got clean away with it because nothing was done for so long. I welcome the statement that was made today. I think it's absolutely brilliant.
You'd expect that in a majority white English country. But that obfuscates our ability, and the police and investigative teams' ability, to identify at-risk and already victimised girls and identify future perpetrators and prevent future crimes from happening, because you're looking at the wrong victim-offender relationship and the wrong victim profile and the wrong offender profile, without acknowledging that this is happening at alarming rates by Pakistani men to white working class girls. You won't be able to stop these abuses. And the interest should be in stopping the abuses rather than upholding racial harmony or community tensions or whatever other ulterior motive that has kept the chilling effect, dampening down the ability to have the discussion and tackle these problems on this scandal for decades. Now, we do have data that has attested to this trend for quite a long time. In 2013, the National Crime Agency found 75% of Type 1 offenders for child sexual abuse were Asian, again, predominantly Pakistani men, and the Quilliam Foundation in 2017 found 84% of those convicted, again, were Asian, of Pakistani origin. So it behooves us to be opaque about this data. We know for a fact that thanks to the rape gang inquiry, privately funded by members of the public and led by Rupert Lowe, there's been thousands of freedom of information requests sent off to police forces, local councils and the like across the country. We now know that, I have been told at least, that reformed, new, dominated local councils will be interested in conducting audits as to whether Pakistani rape gangs have been operating in their area, so we might get some transparency from local councils on that. But we know that Labour-dominated, and more specifically, ethnically Pakistani Muslim-dominated councils will not do this of their own volition and must be dragged kicking and screaming to do this by a government that is more interested in seeking accountability for those who covered up the crimes, justice for the victims, and punishment for the offenders than they are in some sort of John Lennon's Imagine appeasement vision of multiculturalism that tries to ensure that there are no integration issues with third world cultures that regard our children as the spoils of war or as unbelievers and white whores that deserve to be punished, which has been said by the perpetrators themselves, who have gone on racial tirades during their sentencing and shouted Allahu Akbar as they were led out of court. So this data is very important. I hope more people are able to report on and share this data. It was sadly overshadowed in its release by VE Day, but I would have thought that data on the biggest child sex abuse scandal in British history, and probably the greatest moral stain on the British establishment, takes at least a little bit of priority and wants a little bit of airtime over the VE Day parade, especially in the evening after the parade is finished. But there you go. Didn't take place. And I hope that more people can fire off FOI requests, get more data out there, and certainly feel free, if you do come into possession of this data, to contact Courage Media, because we will be reporting on this issue until transparency is achieved for the victims of these heinous crimes. Now, the final story I wanted to go into was Reform's utter revolt against the Uniparty. So the local elections happened in the UK, specifically England, recently, and Reform UK, the insurgent, though no longer self-described populist party, has stormed the board and caused a massive upset. Now, it was predictable for those who knew that Labour was, at the moment, under Keir Starmer, one of the most unpopular governments that the UK has ever had on record, and I am sure that as the re-election results rolled in, Downing Street and Conservative Party headquarters were a bit like Hitler's bunker in Downfall. They had to keep the pistol very much out of reach of Keir Starmer as he saw the numbers of seats that his party and, of course, Kemi Badenoch's were being deducted by Reform UK. So Reform won 10 overall councils and 677 council seats and 2 mayoralties, the new mayoralties of Greater Lincolnshire, that was to Dame Andrea Jenkins, and Hull, that was to a boxer, if I remember correctly, Luke something. Hilarious, I noticed that as soon as Mike Amesbury, the Labour Party MP, who was thrown out of the 16th safest Labour seat, which was Runcorn, for punching a constituent, as soon as he's chucked out for having a dust-up with his constituent, Reform will get a boxer elected up in Hull. So, never say God doesn't have a sense of humour. The Conservatives suffered the worst of all defeats. I think they lost about 44% of all of the defeats of every party in the country. They lost 674 seats, achieving near parity with Reform. They lost 16 councils, and they're down to 0 now that they have under their control. And that's actually a greater percentage share of losses than they suffered at the 2024 general election. It's very telling that only Robert Jenrick's seat in Newham gained councillors. So I wonder, and it's worth talking about later because there's certainly Tory MPs that are making sounds about it, but I wonder if many in CCHQ and the Tory establishment who pulls the strings over there are having buyer's remorse concerning electing Kemi Badenoch as leader and putting her on an easy pathway to it ever since she was elected as an MP in 2017. The Labour Party lost 187 seats, so they're down to 98, and one council. They only had one council under their control. They got no votes at all in 81 council wards, and just 15% of the vote in half of councils. Now, of course, people will chalk this up to being elections being held in more conservative areas, but Labour deliberately intended that certain areas, because they are reorganising their councils into sort of mega councils, they deliberately intended it so that areas like Greater London or Essex did not have local elections occur. And I can tell you now, given how Reform codes as a party, Essex will sweep teal from the Tories, and of course the Red Wall areas largely flipped for Reform from Labour. So the Conservatives are dead in certain areas, and so is Labour. It seems like the two zombies that Peter Hitchens once said are propping each other up as the bodies of the Uniparty. Well, one fell at the last election in 2024, and the other is in the process of falling at the moment. And the first signs of its shadow starting to move towards us was this local election. Peter Hitchens said that and then recommended we vote Tory anyway. Very curious. So it seems that his prediction wasn't borne out in that if you vote for Reform, you'll only ever get Labour. Turns out, if you vote for Reform now, you get Reform. The independent candidates lost 20, so they're down to 89. The Greens gained 44 seats, so they're up to 79. And the Liberal Democrats were also one of the major gainers at 163, so they're up to 370. And they got 3 councils out of this. So what I observed, as I mentioned last week, is that the white English-coded parties are the ones gaining. So Reform UK codes as the populist insurgent party for the dispossessed white working class in the Red Wall and the aspirational working to middle class in outer London and in Essex, the Dinos, right? And they're the ones that have been chased out of their traditional areas by vast numbers of third world migration into the East End of London and broader London, or into northern mill towns, hence the Pakistani Muslim rape scandal. And they're the ones that are also on the precipice of getting a hell of a lot of enrichment by this new plan for installing illegal migrant dispersed accommodation centres funded by Serco in English areas that haven't usually had them. And so the party that codes as white working class, that want to revolt over immigration, for whom 2/3, according to More in Common polling, hold immigration as their paramount issue, were by far the biggest success. And this is why I think a week out from the election, despite running from the prospect of mass deportations, calling them a dark and dangerous use of rhetoric when Rupert Lowe used them, and saying that they're not possible to Stephen Edgington last year, and saying that we can't have amnesty, but we also can't logistically do mass deportations to Winston Marshall last year. I think this is why a week out from the local elections, Nigel Farage got up and gave a press conference saying we're going to deport every single illegal immigrant in the country. It is now our ambition. We'll even appoint a minister for deportations to oversee the process. Again, something I applaud, but something a few weeks ago he would have labelled people as too far to the right to accommodate to reform, or at least say that it's a logistical impossibility and he's not going to get dragged down the route of discussing it. I appreciate the change of mind, and I think that certainly the people within Reform's own base that Adam Wren conducted polling with, where overwhelmingly 99% of them said they want all illegal immigrants deported from the country, the people voting for Reform, members of Reform, expected it, and it's good to see Reform now intending to live up to that promise. Point being, the party that codes as mass deportations, even though they weren't supporting it until a couple of weeks ago, and then the Liberal Democrats, the party which codes as the luxury belief class party, the party that's so anti-political that their leaders' pitch at the last election was to fall off paddleboards and go on Alton Towers rides and completely devolve himself from the political process, the party that complains about Trump like they're boomer Liberal Party in the Anglosphere in Australia or Canada, my commiserations, by the way. The party that does that, but that still codes as the white middle and upper class party in the shires that have hitherto been unmolested by immigration, they're still kind of like Wind in the Willows children's books areas in England, those two parties did the best. The parties of globalization, of mass migration, of calling everyone under the sun far right and saying diversity is our strength, they didn't win. It's the parties promising to ensure that the waters aren't contaminated with sewage, that the hedgerows are still leafy and green, the TikToks and music aren't being played aloud on public transport, and that, in the case of Reform now, all of the illegal migrants and foreign criminals sitting in prison are deported. They did the best. So Farage was correct to say in 2024, this will be the immigration election. And so it'll be interesting to see what Reform actually do when they're governing these councils, because this is now their trial by fire, right? What Reform can do is a number of interesting things. First of all, in the first 100 days, Zia Youssef confirmed on the BBC to Laura Kuenssberg that they're going to be kicking illegal immigrants out of hotels in their districts. And this only happens, by the way, illegal immigrants only get redistributed to certain areas because councils will take money from central government to deploy them in their area, and the councils have had the incentive to do so because lots of local councils have mismanaged their budgets so much that they've been going under. Well, you can do a two-pronged approach to this. First of all, you can empty the hotels of illegal migrants. Andrea Jenkins humorously suggested sticking them in tents in encamped areas, assuming that they're going to be, accelerating their departure from the UK that way. But quite right, I'd rather them stuck in a compound or a disused military barracks with guards watching over them than sitting in a 4-star hotel with free bed and board and healthcare and able to earn, as the Telegraph revealed recently, something we all knew already, £500 a week working for Deliveroo, Just Eats or Uber Eats and paying absolutely no tax and getting discretionary spending subsidies from the taxpayer. They get a bit of pocket money to go spend on JD Sports or in Costa Coffees, just sort of mill about during the daytime while I'm working and paying taxes. No, thank you very much. You can go camping. They can do that. At the same time, they can do a kind of Doge-style audit of council waste. They can, as Farage has tweeted today, refuse to enact costly and racist DEI and climate emergency training at local councils so they can save the taxpayer money and not have the councillors be ideologically brainwashed by a bunch of race grifters and Malthusian sun worshippers. They can also conduct as was mentioned to me by a senior reform source, local rape gang inquiries. And if they are reform councillors, they're more likely to be honest about the racial and religious composition and the aggravation of the gangs and their heinous crimes in their own back gardens. Of course, this isn't every district these have operated in, but there will be some overlap with reform councils that have been elected to spite Labour in historic Labour control areas where the rape gangs have, of course, operated. And they can refuse central government's subsidies for Operation Scatter, so they can thwart the plans of the Labour government to disperse illegal migrants who will be given taxpayer-funded benefits and eventually a path to citizenship in these areas to try and shore up the Labour vote for generations. A prime example of this, as I tweeted, in Northamptonshire Council last year, during the general election, there was an elderly couple called Josie and Ted Saunders, and before the election, their council had written to them mistakenly, saying their house was derelict and they were going to be forced to sell it because the council was, quote, struggling with a shortage of dispersed accommodation due to a, quote, considerable increase in single male asylum seekers. So they were going to force this elderly couple to sell their home to put Tom, Dick and Abdul, who crossed the channel illegally, broke into the country, up at your and my law-abiding taxpayers' expense. Well, on Friday, at the local election, Reform won 13 council seats, Labour lost 6, and the Conservatives lost 9. It turns out treachery has consequences, and I think Reform's local councillors are going to be more inclined to do some hardline measures than maybe even their central office, who have been determined to tack to the centre in recent weeks before reversing their position on mass deportations. Unfortunately, I believe 6 of these councillors, as I've been told by inside sources, have already been suspended, either for social media posts or one because I think he actually lives in France, so I don't know how he slipped through the vetting process. So it's a shame that before positions have even been taken after the election, that 6 of these councillors, at least, have been suspended pending investigation because they've written things on social media, like relating to Tommy Robinson, for example, that Reform don't necessarily like. And it's also a shame, I must say, that after his undeniable victory, Nigel Farage felt the need, on VE Day, outside Buckingham Palace, on GB News, to take further shots at former MP Rupert Lowe, former Deputy Leader Ben Habib, and the broader right who were concerned that he was softening too much on immigration and loosening the modus operandi of the party.
With all of the furore around Rupert Lowe, people were saying, this is it, this is going to be, this isn't just a dent in the Reform Party, this is going to destroy the Reform Party. And over the weekend, people were saying, Rupert who? Yeah. It doesn't appear to have made any sort of impact, despite the best efforts of Andrew Pearce with his journalistic expertise.
Even though I work here, I'm going to be critical of GB News. GB News covered this story obsessively, as if it was some huge story.
It's all his fault.
And it was never a huge story. It was one person who had increasingly been heading in a different direction from us.
Your chairman made it a big story by calling in the police.
Well, he did do that.
Do you think that was a good idea? Nigel Farage, I've got to challenge you.
I'll pass on that.
There we are.
I'll pass on that.
It was a bizarre decision, Yusuf, to call in the police.
But you know, it was only ever going to be one person. And the upshot of this, what it really tells you is that X is not the real world.
Yeah. Correct. You know, Twitter as it was now.
Twitter as it was is not the real world. So, yeah, you know, when you get problems in life, the best thing is to confront them.
Would you have him back now in the party, Rupert Lowe, after all of this? Ben Habib, is there a way back for Ben?
Over my dead body.
Well, he wrote a piece saying you didn't deserve your victory. Did you see it?
I mean, I'm sorry, you get these small, very insignificant people who
say what you think, Nigel.
Who think they're more important than they are. They're frankly nothings. There you are.
Yeah.
And I mean, you know, I don't mind people sounding off. I don't mind people disagreeing with me. I never have done. As long as there's some fundamental underlying loyalty. And that's the one thing I demand.
Yeah. You just kept the ship steady, it seemed, as an observer, when all of the headlines were about Rupert Lowe and Ben Habib and whether this was a split in the political right. You just kept your hand on the tiller, it seemed, and you just carried on in that direction towards those local council elections where you've swept the board by any definition and that by-election. Were you confident, Nigel, all the time throughout that process that it was going to go that way?
Of course. Well, I was confident that Rupert Lowe and the alt-right Tommy Robinson supporters on X, you know, weren't much of a benefit to us. I was confident about that. I was confident it was the right thing to do. You know, I knew it would dent us in the short term, but no more than dent us. But, you know, I mean, look at the image of the party now.
Bear in mind, I like Matt Goodwin, nice chap. But he had said that the online right misread the room after Farage announced mass deportations. I think that without pressure applied by, yes, myself as a critical friend and inclined supporter of Reform UK, but also people that were even more critical and had felt the party had betrayed them and let them down and held their vote on the condition that mass deportations and concern about demographic change were reinstated as statutes of the party. I think without those concerns being expressed, without that pressure being applied on X by the very online right, I don't think we would have got that immigration U-turn, and that I don't think Reform would have listened to the concerns expressed by its base and instead would have continued listening to concerns expressed by a mainstream media that will always call them racist and would rather see the party capsize and collapse than become the next party of government. Listen to concerns made by your friends who want you to win and want you to win in such a fashion that you can govern effectively, rather than the complaints of a media that are trying to hem you into a SW1 bubble and either sabotage your chances of walking into Downing Street in 2029 or make you so indistinguishable to the Uniparty that a victory by you is a victory for them anyway. Now, what's quite interesting is how the other parties have reacted to the rise of Reform. What's happening in the Conservative Party? Well, of course, the Conservative Party are a very jittery bunch, right? Senior Tory sources have told David Maddox at The Independent, at least two senior Tory MPs from the backbench, that they are meeting to plot the ousting of Kemi Badenoch already. Now, she hasn't been in the position for a year. She has to be in the position for the year. And the 1922 committee, which governs the Conservative Party, have even raised the threshold for the number of MPs that need to vote on no confidence to get her out. But they're already plotting ahead of her year in the job to substitute someone else in. They told David Maddox, quote, "We cannot continue as we are, and she's just not up to the task." Another one said, "These results were actually worse than last year's general election. We have somehow gone backwards." Turns out that worshipping a candidate because she's some sort of tough-talking Yoruba auntie who will take no nonsense, and kind of buying into the bullshit veneer of Kemi Badenoch being this door-kicking culture warrior, turns out it didn't pan out. Turns out that selecting explicitly your candidate on the basis of her race and sex and her immigrant heritage at a time where anti-immigration sentiment is rising high because the Conservatives themselves liberalised the immigration system to such an extent that the skilled worker visa had no cap and the salary threshold was set at the minimum wage, and you can bring in limitless numbers of dependents. Turns out that picking an immigrant as your party leader was not a good plan. And it turns out that people on the very online right were saying this to you. It turns out that people actually like Robert Jenrick. They like his policies. They like his attention to detail. They like his concise presentation with these very slick social media videos. They like the fact that he is taking the fight to the government as a kind of one-man opposition movement, single-handedly almost thwarting the two-tier sentencing guidance that was going to be rushed through, that would have incarcerated white men at higher rates than demographics that are more likely to commit certain types of violent crime, like transgender or black or Muslim individuals. So it seems like, judging by the fact that Newham was the only place where Tories made gains, Robert Jenrick would have been the smarter choice. Don't worry, though, ladies and gents. CCHQ are never ones to learn from their mistakes because they're lining up James Cleverly to take over instead. You know, the Home Secretary, so poorly named that he, again, yet oversaw an increase in immigration and then tried to fight the Conservatives' election campaign on saying Labour are going to raise immigration. Also, look, James Cleverly has a squeaky clean veneer, even if he is a bumbling idiot with no credibility on his key issue of immigration serving at the Home Office. However, I have no doubt that if he is a CCHQ favourite, because the Conservative Party is basically a blackmail ring with a party attached, right? According to its own chief whip's latest book, I have no doubt that eventually a skeleton will come rattling out of some closet ahead of his leadership bid. So the Conservatives would be smart to pick Robert Jenrick, and it would be advantageous to Reform supporters, actually, because you'd have a sort of mutually reinforcing right-wing arms race. It would stop Reform from getting complacent. It would show, as the Conservatives campaigned in the late days of the local elections on the fact that Nigel Farage had once said that he didn't want mass deportations, and using clips from his interview with Stephen Edgington, it shows that the direction of political travel, or the momentum, is with immigration skepticism, is with deporting illegal migrants, is with upholding the law, as we used to do in a proper country that we were. And so if Robert Jenrick were the leader, it would be healthier for both parties, even if the Conservatives have absolutely no hope in hell of ever winning back the trust of all the constituencies and the public that they have betrayed with the Boris Wave, with lockdown, with things like entrenching Blair's constitutional and cultural revolution with things like the Equalities Act, or with the two-tier policing, with the non-crime hate incidents. All of these things the Conservatives did that are unforgivable. Even if they can't win voters back, it would still be healthier for politics as a whole for Robert Jenrick to replace Kemi Badenoch. And again, things are being moved in that direction. One Tory MP told The Telegraph, "I think the leader needs to go. I think she's lost the plot. She's not good enough, and I think the people around her aren't good enough either. There's no vision at the moment, and there's no leadership. We've allowed a void to open up, and Nigel Farage has been able to move into it." So some are seeing their rightward flank totally open, and Reform, even if they're not as patriotic, populist, and immigration skeptic as the British public themselves are, Reform are occupying that space. They code that way. However, again, Tories unlikely to learn their lesson, because one Conservative strategist also told The Telegraph, I think, and this is mental, that they think because Pierre Poilievre and Peter Dutton just lost in Canada and Australia, this shows the danger of chasing populist parties like Reform to the right. If you think that Peter Dutton and Pierre Poilievre lost because they were too right-wing, you are genuinely beyond help. Check yourself into a sanatorium, right? They lost because Canada and Australia are demographically, politically, economically, and culturally at least 5 years behind the UK. Because the allegation here is that, by the likes of William Hague, for example, in the Times, and as Liz Truss quipped, if you want to learn how to win an election, do the opposite of what William Hague advises you to do. But the likes of William Hague that suggest that being a right-wing populist party, or a centre-right party as he likes to define himself, and being wedded to Trump is a liability for the electorate, especially in Britain and the Anglosphere. Anyone suggesting that has not reckoned with the fact that Reform codes as Britain's MAGA movement, that Farage codes as Britain's Trump and is currently the most popular party leader in the country and the most likely to become the Prime Minister as of 2029. Hating Trump is a luxury belief. Things in the country, in Britain, have gotten so bad now that actually people are prioritising just the guy who might be boisterous and unpopular coming in and fixing the issues. We are living through the UKification of everything, as Cunley Drugpa and now Luca Watson in The Critic have coined. A kind of transformation of our country into an impoverished, aesthetically ugly dystopia. But not the dystopia we ordered. It's not Blade Runner, right? It's like Blade Runner, but if all the adverts had hijabs in them rather than geishas. And there's also a kind of global monoculture emerging, which is a mix of JD sports apparel, violent crime and honor culture, and gibberish patois. Like, if someone can make a case for why diversity and multiculturalism is such a benefit that the incomprehensible word leng has entered the English lexicon, I'm welcome to hear it, but it's unlikely going to be convincing to the majority of people that have got to live with it. And so, if you want to make anti-Trumpism the flagship policy of a rejuvenated Conservative Party, and you think that's going to see off Reform, go ahead. If you think that not being squishy enough was why Peter Dutton and why Pierre Poilievre lost in Australia and Canada, then you genuinely can never recover from the electorally irrelevant ditch that you have put the Conservatives in. They will be irrelevant for all time. And of course, William Hague did the usual Blairite thing, because he was meant to be leader of the opposition against Blair, but said that, of course, ID cards are the solution to every problem, including migration. It was interesting, though, that he said in another column for The Times that the way the Conservatives can get back is play into the cross-party consensus across Europe of scepticism for migration, because he said that there needs to be a zero refugee policy as the Danes had instituted. Very interesting that he's gone from 2023, where even right-wingers need migration, to zero refugee policy. You can see where the momentum is travelling. But look, if they think that Kemi Badenoch or James Cleverly as her successor is a winning political strategy, yeah, they've got another thing coming. Final comment on Labour. They're now split down the middle. Tony Blair is advising that they ditch net zero and presumably Ed Miliband. Labour overspent for digital ads in Runcorn. It was their 16th safest seat, but they didn't send a single cabinet minister down there except for Wes Streeting from April 29th onward. March 29th onward. So for a good month, Keir Starmer didn't bother visiting, so it showed that, well, they thought Reform might win it. But they still ran massive amounts of digital ads featuring Ed Miliband. Ed Miliband is very unpopular because he's currently costing us hundreds of millions of pounds in having the highest energy costs in the developed world. Tony Blair's basically saying, get rid of him. Whereas failed Transport Secretary Louise Haigh has come up with the bright idea of raising taxes even further. Fantastic. Yeah. This is why you're seeing rumblings about an immigration red list for Pakistan, Bangladesh and Nigeria being unable to claim asylum because people come over on student and work visas, and then to extend their expired visas, they claim asylum. This is why you're seeing movement on migration. This is why you're seeing Labour contemplating a U-turn on the winter fuel allowance. It's because they realise they are radioactively unpopular to the electorate, and they've given this boon to Reform. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Appreciate you returning. Seems that the last show did very, very well. So I will be back next week with Tomlinson Talks. Till then, take care and goodbye.